I remember that afternoon with a painful clarity. The afternoon the divorce papers slid across the glass table and stopped right in front of my hands, as if they were handing me a bill and not the final period of a 3-year marriage. The coffee shop was on the second floor, overlooking a grand avenue right in the heart of the Upper West Side. Through the large windows, the traffic piled up under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with a steady rhythm, and the smell of roasted coffee, mixed with the sickly sweet perfume of the person sitting across from me, left a bitter dryness in my throat. To my left was my husband, Jason. To his right was Allison, my best friend of 20 years. I was sitting across from them, my hands resting on my purse, my back straight, and my eyes fixed on the stack of papers his lawyer had just handed me. The ink on the law firm's certification wasn't even completely dry. Everything had been drafted in a concise, clear, and ruthlessly cold way. The Upper West Side apartment, the 3-row SUV we had bought last year, the remaining savings in our joint account, even the expensive furniture we had once picked out together with such excitement. Everything was meticulously divided in lines of black ink on white paper. The only thing missing was the most important part. "Sign it, Catherine." Jason's voice sounded flat. It wasn't loud, but it was as hard as the glass table separating us. I looked up to meet his eyes. In 3 years of marriage, I had heard him use all kinds of tones: tender, pleading, irritated, even that glacial silence. But I had never heard this tone from him. He sounded like a supervisor rushing an employee to sign a delivery receipt just to get it over with. Allison, sitting next to him, had her hands painted a deep red, resting lightly on the sleeve of Jason's suit jacket. With her head tilted slightly, her voice was so soft that anyone who didn't know the story would have thought she was trying to comfort me out of pure compassion. "Catherine, you can't force the heart. If love has run its course, it's better to let it go. What we have is real." I looked at Allison, that face that had been familiar to me since the 3rd grade, those lips that had laughed and talked with me so many times in my mother's tiny kitchen. I looked at those eyes that had once filled with tears as she hugged me when my father was admitted to the hospital. I didn't see my friend of 20 years anymore. Across from me was just a woman, trying to use a sweet tone to hide the triumph shining deep in her eyes. The coffee shop wasn't loud, so the nearby tables could hear us perfectly. I knew they weren't turning to look at us directly, but their ears were wide open. Their sideways glances brushed against us, and then quietly withdrew. Jason impatient drummed his fingers on the table. "I've already made it very clear. The house is split according to the law. The money right down the middle. I'm not going to let you walk away empty-handed. Making a scene won't do any good." I looked back down at the papers. My hands were freezing, but my mind was strangely clear. That clarity hadn't happened overnight. It didn't start that afternoon, not even when I first discovered his betrayal. It started 3 months earlier, the day Allison showed up at my door with a cream-colored suitcase, her eyes red and her lips trembling, saying she had just broken up with her boyfriend, that she'd been kicked out of the apartment they shared, and that she had nowhere to go. That day, I was the one who opened the door for her. "Stay with us for a few days," I told her, while helping her drag the suitcase inside. "That's what friends are for." 3 months later, she was sitting across from me, stroking my husband's jacket sleeve as if it were a natural gesture deeply rooted in habit. I flipped to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. The clauses were still flawless. Jason's lawyer was undoubtedly a professional, except he didn't know everything. Or maybe he did know and had purposely left it out. I placed the papers back on the table. "I'm not going to sign." Jason froze for a couple of seconds, his face pale, and then it darkened. "Catherine, don't cross the line." Allison gently squeezed his wrist and turned to me with a voice soft as cotton. "Catherine, think about it. Holding on to someone who doesn't love you anymore will only end up hurting you both. I let out a laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a short, dry sound that even felt strange to me. Now you're coming at me with that cliche. Allison was momentarily speechless. Jason frowned. Stop talking in riddles. I've already made my decision. I know, I answered, looking directly into his eyes. And exactly because you've already made your decision, I am not going to sign this. Jason leaned back in his chair, staring at me harshly. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He thought I was going to cry, that I was going to beg, that I was going to remind him of our 3 years of marriage, that I was going to use our parents to threaten him. He thought I would do everything a betrayed woman usually does, only to end up signing out of sheer helplessness. But I didn't do any of that. I pulled my phone out of my purse. Jason frowned. Who are you calling Bit? I didn't answer. I just dialed the number. On the other end, the phone rang once before someone picked up. A male voice resonated deep and formal. Speaking. Daniel, go ahead. I stared at the 2 people in front of me and pronounced every word slowly. Daniel, I need you to come to the coffee shop, please. I've decided to get a divorce, but from now on, I set all the terms. Allison's hand, still resting on Jason's arm, tensed up. He leaned forward. What, Daniel? I hung up the phone and left it on the table, in no rush to answer him. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. The cold liquid went down my throat, but inside I felt a dormant fire. 2 weeks earlier, I was the one who called Daniel for the first time. It was a Wednesday, and Jason was supposed to fly to Boston for a 3-day business meeting with a client. He had packed his suitcase the night before. In the morning, I left the apartment to go to work like always. Jason, still in bed, with his back to me, mumbled a familiar goodbye. I went down to the lobby, waited exactly 15 minutes, and went back up. My morning meeting had been canceled at the last minute the night before, but I hadn't told him at the time. I just had a simple thought. It had been a while since we surprised each other. I would come back early, buy some groceries, and make a nice dinner. If I had let him know, maybe everything would have been different. At the very least, I wouldn't have heard the words that completely woke me up. I used my key to open the door quietly. The apartment was empty except for the bedroom. The door was slightly cracked, and from inside came a woman's laugh, then Jason's voice, and then Allison's. They were broken sentences, but clear enough to understand exactly what my role was in their story. A boring wife. A woman who only knew how to work. An idiot who trusted her best friend and her husband. A bridge for them to walk all over. I didn't kick the door down. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood outside listening to everything. And then I went downstairs and sat on a bench in the courtyard for 3 hours. It was sunny, but my hands were freezing. I don't know what I was looking at. I just remember an elm leaf falling right on my shoe, and I stared at it for a very long time. Around noon, I called Daniel. He was the corporate lawyer who had worked with my company for years, handling mostly civil cases and contracts. To him, I was just a regular project manager, at least on the surface. I asked him to discreetly look into a few matters: the transaction history of our joint bank account, the purchase contract for the SUV Jason drove, and some documents related to the apartment we lived in. 3 days later, Daniel brought me a thick file. I sat in my office and turned each page while feeling the cold take over my entire body. The money from our joint savings account had been almost completely withdrawn in small amounts and transferred to a personal account in Jason's name. The 3-row SUV wasn't a borrowed company car like he had told me. He was paying it off in installments, and the $15,000 down payment had come straight out of our joint account. Over the last 6 months, there were regular monthly transfers under a woman's name. In the memo line, sometimes it said help, sometimes loan, and sometimes it was left blank. That woman was Allison, and that wasn't all. The apartment we lived in was legally only in my name. The money to buy it had been a gift from my parents before the wedding. The monthly mortgage was also paid from my personal account. Jason had only taken the checks to the bank a few times. Over time, he started telling everyone it was a home we had built together. I never gave it much thought. I used to think that in a shared life, you didn't need to keep score of those things. Now I understood that sometimes it's not about competing. It's just that there are people who silently keep track of what's yours, day after day. Catherine. Jason's voice pulled me back to the present. I'm asking you for the last time. What are you planning to do? I placed both hands on the table, interlacing my fingers so they wouldn't shake. I looked at him and then at Allison. That's a question I should be asking the two of you. Allison bit her lip, trying to maintain a serene expression. Catherine, don't complicate things. Let's just let everything fall into place. Yes, everything in its place. I nodded. Good. Today, we're going to make everything crystal clear. Right at that moment, the coffee shop door opened. A man in his 40s, in an impeccable white shirt and a black leather briefcase, walked in, accompanied by a young secretary. He walked with a quick pace, scanning the room until his eyes landed on our table. Jason turned to look, and Allison did the same. I watched their expressions change almost at the exact same time. Daniel stopped by the table, gave me a slight nod, and then pulled out a chair to sit down. The secretary placed a perfectly organized file in front of him. Apologies, I'm 5 minutes late, he said. I shook my head gently. You're right on time. Jason looked from Daniel to me, and his eyes started to show a deep unease. For the first time in months, I felt my heart calm down a little. Not because the pain was gone, but because I knew that from this moment on, they were no longer controlling the game. I slowly dragged the divorce papers back toward me. I flipped to the last page and looked up at the man who had been my husband. You want a divorce? Fine, I said. But before I sign anything, we are going to recalculate every single cent, every document, and every pending issue, including the things you think I don't know. Jason didn't have time to answer. Allison's face had turned paper white, and I, sitting perfectly straight, listened to the slow, steady beat of my own heart. It was as if from the ashes of 3 years of resignation, another woman was slowly standing up. As soon as Daniel sat down, the air at the table seemed to run out of oxygen. At the next table, a teaspoon clinked against a ceramic mug. The coffee grinder at the counter kept up its steady hum, and cars continued to drive down Madison Avenue. Yet, in the space separating the four of us, I could clearly hear Allison's breathing start to speed up. The sweet, refined facade she had tried to keep up had cracked into a small wrinkle near her eyes. Jason, for his part, straightened up in his chair, his shoulders tense. The hand resting on the edge of the table was no longer drumming, but his index finger moved with an almost imperceptible rhythm, one that only someone who had lived with him for 3 years would have noticed. Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a file thinner than I expected. I glanced at the edges of the pages, marked with colored tabs, everything perfectly organized. He didn't speak right away. First, he addressed me with the same professional tone he used at the office. Miss Catherine, before we begin, allow me to confirm something. I am here at your request, acting as your legal representation to protect your interests in the preparation of the divorce proceedings and the review of assets. Is that correct? I nodded. Correct. Only then did Daniel turn to Jason, polite but direct. I am Daniel, the attorney, hired by Miss Catherine. If you have decided that the divorce is irreconcilable, I suggest that from now on, all conversations focus strictly on documents numbers and legal grounds. That will save time for both parties. Jason let out a bitter, silent laugh. Wow, you really prepared for this, Catherine. Are you better prepared than I thought? I looked at him. If I hadn't prepared, I would have already signed those papers dividing everything down the middle, even the things that were never yours. Allison shifted slightly next to him and chimed in with her usual syrupy voice. Catherine, don't speak so harshly. Jason just wanted everything to be resolved amicably from the start. I turned to Allison. You sleep together in my house, you spend the money from my joint marital account, and now you dare talk to me about being amicable? Allison's face flushed red, but she immediately slipped back into the victim role. I know you're angry. If you want to insult me, I'll take it. But feelings don't talk to me about feelings. I cut her off. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to shut her up. If this was really about feelings, you wouldn't have needed to take this route. Daniel opened the file, took out the first document, and placed it in the center of the table. Let's get straight to the point. According to the property deed for the apartment located on the Upper West Side, the sole owner at the time of purchase is Ms. Catherine. The down payment was transferred from an account in the name of Ms. Catherine's parents to her personal account. Subsequently, the entire mortgage payment history shows that the funds came from Ms. Catherine's personal account. When you married, one person's money belongs to both, Jason snapped. Daniel's expression didn't change. Funds used during married life can sometimes be difficult to separate, but the law recognizes assets whose origin can be clearly proven as separate property. In the case of this apartment, the documentation is quite clear. Jason turned to me, his eyes burning with rage. You hid this from me? I felt a bitter laugh form in my throat. Hid it from you? You lived in that house for 3 years. Not once did you ask whose name was on the deed or what money was paying for it. And now you say I hid it from you? Or is it just that you only care about how much you're taking away in the divorce? My words made Jason clench his fists. I knew he was holding back because the coffee shop was full, because there was a lawyer present, and because he still wanted to keep up appearances. But his face had taken on a grayish tone, the same color it turned the day I showed him the picture of the car purchase contract. Daniel pulled out another piece of paper. Next, the vehicle currently used by Mr. Jason. The purchase contract is in his name. The $15,000 down payment was transferred from the couple's joint account. However, at that time, Miss Catherine did not sign any documents or give written consent to convert a marital asset into a private asset in your name. Therefore, the funds for that down payment must be reviewed. Allison started shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Daniel, I think there must be a misunderstanding. Jason uses the SUV for work. He didn't buy it for... Daniel turned to her, maintaining his courtesy. Excuse me, I am working with Mr. Jason and Miss Catherine. You are not an interested party in this procedure, so I ask that you refrain from making statements on his behalf. The sentence was as smooth as it was sharp, leaving Allison completely speechless. I looked at her and saw her hands gripping the edge of her skirt. The red polish on her nails looked flashier and cheaper than ever. Jason took a deep breath and said, struggling to stay calm, Fine. Let's assume the house isn't split. The car needs to be reviewed. And the savings, according to the law, remain joint assets. Daniel nodded. Exactly. And that is why everything must be calculated correctly. Over the last 7 months, multiple withdrawals have been made from the joint account, totaling almost $50,000. The majority was transferred to your personal account, and from there, certain amounts were transferred to a third party. Without anyone having to say her name, Allison knew who that third party was. Her face turned livid. Jason, on the other hand, slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glass vibrated. I lent money to a friend. What's wrong with that? Allison was going through a hard time. I looked at him slowly. Whose friend? A friend of mine who needs my husband to secretly wire her thousands of dollars. A friend of mine who lives in my house, wears my clothes, uses my things, and sleeps with my husband. I paused and looked him dead in the eye. Go on, I'm listening. The coffee shop fell almost completely silent. I knew many eyes were locked on us, but in that moment, I didn't feel any shame. I had already swallowed the biggest shame that morning, standing outside the door of my own bedroom. After that, the stares of strangers were just wind. Suddenly, Allison burst into tears. "Catherine, please, don't say these things in public. I know I was wrong, but it wasn't our intention to hurt you this much." I looked at her for a long time. There are faces you know that you've known your entire youth. Faces you think you could recognize even with your eyes closed. But only when they betray you do you understand that the most familiar thing can also be the most fake. From the moment you walked into my house with that suitcase, it was all intentional, I said quietly. But every word rang clear. The only fool was me for taking so long to believe it. Allison opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Jason instinctively turned toward her. It was a fleeting glance, but enough to catch a flash of impatience. They were no longer on the same united team like at the beginning. That's how people act when they think they hold all the power. The second you touch their weak spot, they start looking at each other with resentment. Daniel closed a section of the file, his voice still measured. "I will warn you in advance, Mr. Jason. If both parties reach an agreement, everything will be much simpler. But if you insist on this draft intentionally omitting funds that must be returned or misreporting assets, Ms. Catherine has every right to petition the court for a forensic audit to investigate the money flows, the purpose of the transfers, and the use of marital assets during the marriage." Jason let out a mocking laugh. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Daniel replied. "I am simply informing you of the legal consequences if the conflict escalates." Jason stayed silent. I watched his Adam's apple bob slightly as he swallowed. He was scared. Not scared of losing me. He had thrown that fear away a long time ago. What he feared was losing money, prestige, control of the situation, and possibly other things he was trying to hide even deeper. I knew this because in the file Daniel had brought that day, aside from the house, the car, and the accounts there, was a section that hadn't been opened yet. A section related to Jason's work, to the project he was planning to take to a rival company to secure a better position. Daniel hadn't mentioned it because I didn't want him to yet. There are cards you have to hold close to your chest until your opponent thinks he's seen it all. Jason remained silent for almost half a minute before speaking in a noticeably softer tone. "Catherine, let's go back to the apartment and talk in private. There's no need to make a scene here." Hearing him, I just felt exhausted. When he and Allison drafted those divorce papers to force me to sign, he hadn't thought about talking in private. When he emptied the joint account, he hadn't thought about negotiating. Only now realizing that I wasn't going to sit back and take it, did he suddenly remember the words marriage and privacy. "There is nothing left to talk about in private," I answered. "Whatever needs to be said, let's say it here and make it clear." Through the window, the sun had faded, casting a honey-colored glow over the asphalt. I suddenly thought that a sunset is a lot like a marriage. Sometimes, from a distance, it looks warm. But only when you get closer do you realize the light is actually dying out. Daniel pushed the divorce papers back toward Jason. "You can keep this draft, but in my professional opinion, it no longer holds any negotiating value. Miss Catherine's side will send you a new proposal in the coming days, along with an inventory of assets, the amounts that must be reconciled, and the specific demands. When you receive it, I highly recommend you read it very carefully." Jason didn't pick up the papers. Allison beside him didn't dare touch his shoulder anymore. The two of them, who had started with an aggressive attitude to corner me, were now sitting in silence as if the slightest movement could bring everything crashing down before their eyes. I was the first to stand up, resting my hand on the strap of my purse. My palms were still cold, but my legs were no longer shaking. "Jason," I said, looking down at the man who, for 3 years, had been my rock, the man I had trusted blindly. This is just the beginning. What you took from me through deceit, I will take back, piece by piece. And what you owe me for your betrayal, you probably won't be able to pay back in a lifetime." With that, I turned around. Daniel stood up to follow me. Just as I reached the stairs, I heard the sound of a chair scraping harshly behind me, and Allison's alarmed voice calling out to him quietly. "Jason." I didn't turn around. There are affections that, once dead, are better left without looking back. Looking back only forces you to see the corpse. Stepping out of the coffee shop, the late afternoon wind hit my face, fresh and sharp. I stopped for a few seconds under the shade of a maple tree on the sidewalk. Daniel didn't rush me. He just stood by my side, waiting in silence. After a while, he asked in a very low voice, "Are you okay?" I watched the stream of cars passing by and felt a twinge of pain in my chest. But this time, the pain didn't crush me. It felt like a freshly cleaned wound. It stung straight to the soul, but at least it had stopped festering. "I'm fine," I answered. And after letting out a long sigh, I added, "But I don't think this is going to end with just a division of assets." "Daniel." He turned to look at me, and I held his gaze. "The stuff related to his work," I said. "I'll tell you everything tomorrow." The wind blew again. At the end of the cross street, a florist was busy tying up bouquets of sunflowers. I don't know why, but that image reminded me of my mother. Whenever there was a problem at home, she didn't cry right away. In silence, she would start washing dishes, wiping down the table, or folding a pile of clothes. It seems the women in my family are built like that. No matter how much it hurts, we don't allow ourselves to collapse halfway down the road. I gripped my purse strap tighter and stepped off the curb. I knew that starting tomorrow, I wouldn't just be dealing with the divorce. I was going to face the ugliest side of Jason's personality, a side that, had I not discovered it with my own eyes, would probably have taken me to my grave, thinking he was just a cheating husband, when the truth was much worse. I didn't go straight home that night. I let Daniel take me to his office, a space on the 7th floor of an old building near Central Park. The sky had gone completely dark. The yellowish light from the street lamps filtered through the large windows, tracing long stripes across the tile floor. The city wasn't as loud as it was in the afternoon, but it wasn't quiet enough to lift the weight off a heavy heart either. Daniel made me a cup of hot tea, set it in front of me, and sat across from me without rushing, without pressuring me with questions. He gave me time to breathe, to sort out the chaos inside my head. I held the cup with both hands, feeling the heat slowly spread through my palms. It was a small warmth, but enough to remind me I was still standing. "Daniel," I said after a moment of silence, "the stuff regarding Jason's work, I want you to look at it." He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." I opened my purse and pulled out a small USB drive. I had carried it with me for the last 2 weeks, ever since the day Daniel handed me the first file. I hadn't wanted to open it right away, because I knew that as soon as I saw what was inside, there would be no turning back. "These are files I pulled from his computer," I said. It wasn't like I was purposely snooping. I just wanted to check an old contract, and I saw it by accident. Daniel took the flash drive and plugged it into his laptop. The screen lit up, showing a series of perfectly organized folders. He opened an Excel file, then a PDF, and his eyes lingered on some numbers. The air in the office grew thick. I didn't need to look to know that what he was reading wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. About 10 minutes later, he looked up. His expression wasn't as calm as it was in the coffee shop. It was deeper, much more grave. "Are you sure these files belong to Jason?" he asked. "Positive," I answered. "The user account is his, and the emails inside are his work emails." Daniel nodded slowly. "If what's shown here is accurate, the problem is no longer limited to a marital asset dispute." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He half closed the laptop as if measuring his words. There are indications in these files that Jason has been transferring internal project data to a competing firm. It includes budgets, client lists, and highly confidential proprietary information. If your company finds out about this, the consequences will be extremely severe. Hearing that, I felt my heart shrink. Not out of surprise, I had suspected it since the first time I saw those files. But hearing it confirmed by someone else hurt just like the first time. I've been at that company for almost 8 years, I said slowly. I started as an entry-level employee and worked my way up to project manager. I treated every project as if it were my own, and he used exactly that to secure a new job somewhere else. Daniel looked at me, his voice softening. What do you want to do? I didn't answer right away. I stood up and walked over to the window. Down below, the car headlights formed an endless river. There were people rushing home, others still out making a living, and others like me, standing at a crossroads, unsure of how many things they had just lost. I've thought a lot about this over the past 2 weeks, I said, my eyes still fixed on the street. If it were just infidelity, I could have signed the papers, split the assets, and made a clean break. A one-time pain, and that's it. But this isn't a private matter between 2 people anymore. Daniel didn't interrupt me. He let me finish. I can't stay quiet, I continued. Not out of revenge, but because if I keep my mouth shut, the people who trusted me, my coworkers, will suffer the fallout. Saying it, I remembered the company's main boardroom, where I had sat countless times, defending every plan, every metric. I remembered the colleagues who had pulled all-nighters with me to meet deadlines. And I remembered the way Jason used to put his hand on my shoulder and tell me he was proud of me. It turns out some words aren't said to be kept. They're said to hide the truth. Daniel nodded, his eyes regaining their calm. If that is your decision, I will help you prepare everything you need. But you have to understand that when this comes to light, it won't stop at a simple warning. There could be an internal corporate audit and potentially legal consequences for him. I understand, I replied. And I accept that. He watched me for another moment and then said, Then tomorrow, you should meet directly with your company's executive team and clearly lay out what you have. On my end, I will simultaneously draft the divorce petition on the most favorable terms for you, including the claim for the funds Jason misappropriated. I walked back to the desk, picked up my cup of tea, and took a sip. It had gone lukewarm, but the bitter taste was still there. Thank you, I said. Daniel shook his head. You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing my job. You've got the hardest part ahead of you. I gave a faint smile. I've already survived the hardest part. He didn't ask anything else. Maybe he understood that the hardest part isn't facing the truth, but accepting it. Leaving his office, I took a cab home. The car pulled up to my familiar apartment building. I sat in the back seat for a few extra seconds before stepping out. Night had completely fallen. The hallway was deserted, lit only by harsh, cold fluorescent lights. I unlocked the door with my key. Inside it was pitch black. There were no voices, no lights, no familiar smell of a home once shared by 2 people. I flipped the switch. The space was intact, but strangely alien. The couch was still there, the dining table too. Jason's jacket was still draped over a chair like always, but the feeling was gone. I walked into the bedroom. The door was slightly cracked, just like the day I stood outside listening. Only this time, there was no one inside. I opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase, not to pack my things and leave, but to pack away what no longer belonged to me. I folded Jason's clothes piece by piece, placing them in the suitcase without rushing, without stopping. Very much like my mother did every time she tidied up the house. There are things that seem insignificant, but only when you have to pack them away with your own hands do you realize how heavy they truly are. When the suitcase was full, I zipped it shut. The sound echoed dryly in the silent room. I left it in a corner, stared at it for a moment, and turned away. I didn't cry that night. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. In my mind, the image of Allison and Jason's words had vanished. Only one very clear feeling remained. It was truly over. But the end wasn't the finale. The next day, I would walk into my company not as a betrayed wife, but as someone who had to defend what she had built over 8 years. And I knew that when that door opened, my life would take a different path. One where no one could trample on my trust as easily as before. Outside the window, the sky was starting to lighten. A new day was arriving with the same normalcy as always, but for me, it was the beginning of a different journey. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was in a rush, but because I didn't want to stay in that bed. There are places that were once a refuge, but after a hit, they become the most suffocating places on earth. I went to the kitchen, boiled water, and made coffee just like I did every day. The aroma drifted through the silent apartment, but this time it didn't feel familiar. I used to make 2 cups every morning, one for me and one for Jason. He liked his coffee black, no sugar. Sometimes, rushing out the door, he would take just 1 sip and leave the rest. I used to pour it down the sink, thinking it was a silly, meaningless thing. Now, standing alone, watching the steam rise from my mug, I saw more clearly than ever everything I had overlooked. I didn't finish the coffee. I left it on the counter and went to get dressed. I chose a light gray tailored suit, simple and sharp. I put on light makeup and pulled my hair back. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw the same face, but my eyes were different. There was no more doubt or waiting in them, only a clarity, almost freezing cold. Before leaving, I stopped by the corner of the bedroom where Jason's suitcase had sat since the night before. I looked at it for a moment and then dragged it to the entryway. I didn't put it out in the hall. I just left it against the wall, right where he would see it the second he walked in. There are things that don't need words. Seeing them is enough. I locked the door and stepped into the elevator. In the enclosed space, my reflection looked severe in the stainless steel panels. I stood tall, gripping my purse, and took a deep breath. From that moment on, every step I took wouldn't just be for me, but for everything I had nurtured for years. The car dropped me off in front of the corporate building at 8:15 in the morning. The lobby was bustling as always. Employees swiping their badges, greeting each other, the beep of the turnstiles. No one knew what I was carrying inside, and I didn't want anyone to know. I took the elevator straight to the 12th floor, the executive wing. Before walking in, I paused for a second, adjusted the collar of my jacket, and knocked on the door. "Come in!" The VP's voice echoed from inside. I pushed the door open and walked in. There were 3 people in the room: the VP of Operations, the General Counsel, and the VP of Projects. They looked at me with some surprise since I didn't have an appointment, but they maintained their professional demeanor. "Catherine, what's up?" asked the VP of Operations. I closed the door behind me, walked up to the conference table, set my purse down, and said slowly, "I would like to report an issue regarding the security of one of our projects." The mood in the room changed instantly. The General Counsel looked up, her eyes turning sharper. "What exactly is this about?" I pulled the USB drive out of my purse and placed it on the table. "I suspect there has been an external leak of internal data. The employee involved is Jason." The 3 of them stayed silent for a few seconds. Not because they didn't understand, but because they needed time to process the weight of the accusation. The VP of Operations frowned slightly. "You have proof?" "It's all right here," I answered, including the data files, communication logs, and several unreleased documents. The General Counsel took the flash drive and plugged it into her laptop. The screen filled with files. She opened them quickly, scanned through, and stopped on a client list. I clearly saw her expression shift from doubt to tension, and finally, to absolute gravity. "Catherine, are you sure this data comes from our internal servers?" she asked. "I'm sure," I stated. "I manage that project directly. I recognize every single file." The VP of Projects rested his hands on the table, his voice dropping an octave. "If this is true, we're no longer talking about a simple policy violation. This is corporate espionage." I nodded. "I understand." The VP of Operations didn't speak right away. He stared at the screen for a long time before turning to me. "Catherine, be completely honest. Do you have anything to do with this?" The question didn't surprise me. In corporate America, when a massive leak happens, the person closest to the source data is always the first suspect. "No," I answered directly. "And I came here today precisely to ensure there are no misunderstandings moving forward." He watched me for a few more seconds and then gave a slight nod. "I believe you." It was just one sentence, but I felt a knot form in my throat. Sometimes, the trust of others is the only thing keeping you on your feet. The general counsel closed her laptop screen and turned to the VP. "I recommend we immediately revoke all of Jason's system access and initiate a full forensic IT audit. We need to do this right now." He nodded. "Do it, and keep it strictly confidential." Then he looked back at me. "And you, from now on, any documentation related to this project, you report directly to me. No middlemen." Understood. The meeting wasn't long, but it was enough to set everything in motion. I stood up, thanked them, and walked out. When the door clicked shut behind me, I let out a long sigh. The hallway was still brightly lit. People were coming and going, but inside me, a part of the burden had lifted. I went back to my desk. Everything looked the same. My tidy workspace, my monitor sitting above a stack of project folders on the side. My coworkers were still laughing and chatting about work over coffee. No one knew that in a single morning, a massive bomb had been uncovered. I sat down, woke up my computer, and saw a new email in my inbox. It was from Jason. The subject line was brief. "We need to talk." I stared at the text for a moment and opened it. "Catherine, I just got a notification that my system access has been revoked. What did you do?" I read the message and didn't reply. I closed the email and opened another spreadsheet. There are questions that don't need an answer. The person asking them eventually figures it out on their own. Around noon, my cell phone vibrated. Jason's name popped up on the screen. I let it ring to the very end and then picked up. "What the hell did you do?" His voice on the other end sounded panicked, completely stripped of the calm he had maintained the day before. "My job," I answered. "Are you crazy? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Do you have any idea what you did?" There was silence on the line for a few seconds, and then his tone dropped. "Catherine, one thing is one thing, and another thing is another. Work is work. Personal is personal. They don't mix." I let out a soft laugh. "You were the one who mixed them first. You used internal company data to buy yourself a better job." Jason couldn't answer immediately. I could clearly hear his ragged breathing through the speaker. "Are you trying to ruin me?" he asked. "I'm not ruining anyone," I replied. "I just stopped covering for you." The line went completely dead silent. I knew there were words that once spoken could never be taken back. "I'm coming to the apartment tonight," Jason said after a while. "We have to talk." "No need," I replied. "Just come get your things. I've already packed them." I hung up. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked out the window. The midday sun wasn't scorching, but its light reflected off the glass facades of the skyscrapers with such intensity that I had to squint. Under that harsh light, I suddenly saw the path I was taking much more clearly. It wasn't easy. It wasn't light. but it was the only one I could choose if I wanted to save what was left of me. That afternoon, the company started moving in silence. A few people were pulled into private meeting rooms. Systems were audited discreetly, and Jason's name started popping up next to questions that were no longer casual. I didn't participate in any of those conversations. I stayed at my desk, doing my job like any other Tuesday. There are processes that, once initiated, don't require you to stand there and watch. They follow their own inevitable course, right to the end. At the end of the day, I gathered my things and got ready to leave. As I walked past the main boardroom, I noticed the door was cracked open and several executives were still inside. I didn't stop. Stepping out of the building, the sun had already softened. The evening breeze blew lightly, carrying the familiar smell of city dust and hot asphalt. I walked down the steps, feeling a little lighter than I had in the morning. Not because it was all over, but because I knew I had taken the first step without looking back. And I understood that from now on, every next step wouldn't be to defend myself, but to face things head on. I got home earlier than usual that night, not because I wanted to rest, but because I knew Jason was coming, not to see me, but to pick up his things. Either way, I wanted to be there, not to talk, but to definitively close a chapter of my life. The apartment was just as quiet as it had been that morning. I turned on the lights, dropped my purse on the table, and went straight to the kitchen. I made a simple dinner: grilled salmon, a side salad, and some roasted potatoes. Not because I still wanted to take care of someone, but because I needed a normal routine to keep from falling into the void. Just as the salmon started sizzling in the pan, I heard the front door unlock. The sound was familiar, but this time, it brought no sense of expectation. Jason walked in, stood in the entryway for a few seconds as if scanning the apartment to see if anything had changed. His eyes landed on the suitcase by the wall, and then moved to me in the kitchen. There was no greeting. "You really did it," he said, his voice heavy. I turned off the burner and faced him. "You can see that I did." He stepped further inside and closed the door behind him. He wasn't wearing a suit that day, just a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark pants. But his polished look couldn't hide the obvious exhaustion etched into his face. "The company is investigating me," he said. "I know it. You didn't have to take it this far." "I didn't do anything," I answered. "I just stopped hiding it." Jason smiled bitterly. "You changed real fast." I looked at him and then at the suitcase. "I didn't change. I just see everything clearly now." He went quiet. The air between us wasn't as tense as it had been in the coffee shop, but it was heavier, like a room that had been kept shut for way too long. "Catherine," he said in a low voice, "can we just talk for a minute?" I didn't say no, but I didn't invite him to sit down either. I simply stood in front of him, keeping enough distance so we wouldn't touch. "I know I screwed up," he said. "I'm not going to justify what happened with Allison. But could you just help me out this one time with the work thing? All you have to say is that it was a misunderstanding, a mix-up with the files, and it'll all be much less severe." Hearing that, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. Sadness that even in that moment he still thought I would slip back into my old role, the woman who stayed quiet to keep the peace. "Are you asking me to cover up corporate espionage for you?" I asked coldly. "I just need more time," he said quickly. "I have that offer at the other firm. If this gets out, I lose everything. I mean it." "So you want to walk away with what you stole and leave me dealing with the fallout?" Jason frowned. "You're being too harsh." I shook my head. "I'm just telling the truth." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a slightly softer, almost begging tone. "Catherine, despite everything, we were husband and wife. I don't want things to reach a point of no return." I looked at him and saw not an ounce of remorse in his eyes, just pure panic. Panic for his career, for his future, for everything he was about to lose. Not for me. "You're wrong," I said slowly. Things reached a point of no return long before you even realized it. He froze, then let out a heavy sigh. Then what do you want? I didn't answer right away. I walked over to the dining table. I picked up a stack of papers Daniel had sent over by courier that afternoon and slid them in front of him. This is the new draft, I said. Read it. Jason picked it up and flipped through a few pages. The more he read, the darker his face got. The apartment was not to be split. The down payment for the SUV had to be returned, along with his half of the drained joint account. Every single dollar he had wired to Allison had to be accounted for and reimbursed. He stopped and looked up at me. And you're demanding extra compensation. I'm not demanding it, I replied. I'm just documenting exactly what you took. You're backing me into a corner. I'm just stopping you from taking any more. Jason gripped the papers tightly. Catherine, if you do this, you leave me with no way out. They left me with no way out too, I said. The only difference is that I didn't have a lawyer. I wasn't prepared, and I didn't have anyone on my side. My words silenced him. I saw a flash of pure bewilderment cross his face. It was brief, but enough to know that for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be completely cornered out of options. And Allison? He asked, his voice dragging. I have nothing to discuss with her, I replied. Everything related to the money is your responsibility. You still hate her. I shook my head. No, she just has nothing to do with me anymore. My answer threw him off. Maybe he expected harsher words or at least a show of fury. But by then, that emotion had already burned out. When something breaks completely, you don't have the energy left to hate. All that's left is a void. Jason dropped the papers back on the table and sat down, burying his face in his hands. I never thought things would end up like this. I looked at him feeling practically nothing. Neither did I. After a while, he looked up. If I sign you, stop there. I'll handle my side of the divorce, I said. The company's investigation is out of my hands. He smiled bitterly. So you're just going to let them deal with me? I'm not letting anyone deal with anyone, I answered. You did something, and now you face the consequences. Silence fell again. Outside the window, it was completely dark now. The lights of the skyscrapers across the street clicked on one by one. Jason stood up and walked over to the suitcase. He dragged it to the middle of the living room, unzipped it, and looked inside. The clothes were folded impeccably, piece by piece. Nothing was missing. Nothing was extra. He stood there for a long time, then spoke in a low voice. You packed this carefully. You really didn't want me coming back looking for anything else. I nodded slightly. Yes. A soft yes, but it sounded millions of miles away. He zipped it back up and grabbed the handle. When he reached the front door, he stopped with his back to me. Catherine, he said. I didn't answer. I stood completely still. If you ever need help, tell me. I stared at his back, watching a man I had once trusted with my life, now as alien as an old acquaintance. I don't need it anymore, I said. The door opened and closed behind him. The click of the deadbolt was faint, but inside me, it sounded like a heavy, definitive period at the end of a long sentence. I stood motionless in the empty apartment for a long time. There were no footsteps, no voices, no trace of the man who had lived with me for 3 years. It was just me and the long, stretching silence. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the cold roasted potatoes, the untouched salmon. I sat at the table, served myself a small portion, and ate slowly, bite by bite. It tasted the same as always, but the feeling was completely different. There was no one left to wait for, no one to share it with. But there was also no one left I had to endure. Those small daily tasks helped keep my mind anchored. The night wore on. I turned off the living room lights, leaving only a dim lamp on in the bedroom. Before getting into bed, I scanned the room one last time. No suitcase, no jacket, No trace of him. I lay down, pulled the blanket over me, and closed my eyes. I didn't see Jason's face anymore. I just had one crystal clear feeling. I had walked a very long road, and I had finally managed to get off it. Tomorrow, everything would carry on, but at least starting today, the past wouldn't drag me down with it. And that was enough. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. Not because I had an overwhelming workload, but because I wanted to take the reins of the new day. After everything that had happened, I understood something perfectly. If I stopped moving, others would make decisions for me. The building was the same as always, brightly lit with people flowing in and out. But walking into the lobby, I noticed an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Something subtle, but blatantly obvious to anyone involved. The glances from some coworkers lingered on me a second too long before quickly darting away. No one asked questions, but I knew the rumors had already started circulating. In a corporate environment, no secret stays buried for long. I went straight to my floor. Sitting at my desk, I saw 3 new emails from the legal department and one from the VP. The content was brief. They needed me to provide more precise details on the projects Jason had touched over the last 6 months. I opened each file and answered every question, without rushing, without pausing, with absolute precision and thoroughness. There were metrics and dates I previously knew by heart, simply to do my job. Now they had become evidence. Every time I typed a line, I felt as if I were physically sealing off a part of my past with my own hands. Around 9:30 a.m., the general counsel called me into a small meeting room. She was there with an internal controls auditor. They didn't beat around the bush. "Catherine," the general counsel said, her tone serious but not hostile, "we've done a preliminary review. The data you provided holds up. But to be absolutely sure before moving forward with termination and a lawsuit, we need you to confirm some specific timelines." I nodded. "Ask whatever you need." The meeting lasted almost an hour. Every detail was scrutinized, every file cross-referenced with other data. Sometimes they asked the same question in different ways, just to check my consistency. I understood it was standard procedure. When we finished, the general counsel looked at me for a moment. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you did the right thing." I didn't say anything. I just gave a slight nod. There are words that, even when spoken softly, are enough to help you stand a little taller. Leaving the meeting room, I went back to my desk. My team was still working, but the vibe had completely shifted. Some looked at me with caution, others with burning curiosity, and a few with quiet respect. I didn't blame them. When a bomb drops, people usually watch from a safe distance before deciding where to stand. At noon, I got a text message from an unsaved number. "Catherine, it's Allison. Can we meet for a minute?" I stared at the message for a long time. Seeing her name on the screen dragged up a chain of memories. From our childhood days, to shared dinners, the times we swapped secrets about our families and careers, and the day she showed up at my door with her suitcase. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down and kept working. But about 10 minutes later, a second message came through. "I know you don't want to see me, but there are things I need to explain to you." I looked back at the screen. Not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I understood that there are things that, if left unsaid, simply hang suspended forever without being resolved. I texted back. 3 p.m., the usual coffee shop. She replied almost instantly. "Okay." That afternoon, I left the office right on time. I didn't overthink it on the way there. There are meetings you don't need to prepare for. You just have to bring your clarity with you. The coffee shop was the same one from the other day. The same table, the same window overlooking Madison Avenue, the same afternoon light spilling over the wood. The only difference was that Jason wasn't there. Allison had already arrived. She was sitting with her back stiff, her hands folded in her lap, her expression tense. When she saw me walk in, she stood up instinctively. "Catherine," she said quietly. I nodded and sat across from her. The silence stretched for several seconds. A barista walked over. I ordered a glass of water. Allison ordered a coffee, but when they brought it, she didn't touch it. "I am so incredibly sorry, Catherine," she said, her voice weak. I didn't react. I looked out the window where the traffic was still flowing, and then looked back at her. "What did you want to tell me?" Allison bit her lip, her eyes bloodshot. "I know I screwed up. I have no excuse. But I don't want you to think I was like this from the beginning." "From what beginning?" I asked. "Since I moved in with you guys," she said quickly. "At first, I swear to you, I only saw it as a temporary place to stay. I had absolutely no intentions with Jason." I watched her, letting her talk. "But then we started talking more. He would complain to me about you, about how busy you were at the firm, about how little you cared about keeping up the apartment, and I saw how lonely he was." Hearing her, I felt a chill. Not of heartbreak, but of disgust. Those excuses were so deeply familiar, so painfully cliché, that literally anyone could use them to justify horrible behavior. "He was lonely?" I asked. Allison shook her head, and her tears finally spilled over. "I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, I just couldn't stop." "You couldn't, or you didn't want to?" I pressed. She went completely silent. I sighed softly. "Do you know what I really can't accept? It's not that you and Jason slept together. It's the way you wormed your way into my life, treating me like a sister while you were doing that behind my back." Allison lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I have absolutely no intention of forgiving you," I said firmly. She looked up, her eyes puffy and red. "Then why did you come today?" "To close this once and for all," I answered. "So that if we ever cross paths by accident in the city, I don't have to avoid you or carry any of this." Allison looked at me with an expression of shock that slowly melted into deep sadness. "You're stronger than I thought." "I'm not strong," I said. "I just don't want to be weak anymore." Another silence. The clinking of a teaspoon at the next table sounded crisp and clear. "Did Jason tell you anything?" Allison asked hesitantly. "Yes," I answered. "He wanted me to help cover up the corporate theft he committed against the company." Allison froze. "He really asked you that?" "I have no reason to lie to you." She sat completely still, as if she had just realized something terrible. "I didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "Because if you knew, you probably wouldn't be sitting here asking me." Allison offered a sad, pathetic smile. "Maybe I thought he was different." "We both thought that at some point," I replied. That sentence left us both in silence. Not because there were no words left, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said. I was the first to stand up. "I'm leaving." Allison stood up too. "Catherine, really, I am so sorry." I looked at her one last time. Her face was still the same one I had known since childhood, but everything inside it had changed. "I heard you," I said, "but keep that apology for yourself." With that, I turned around and walked out of the coffee shop. The late afternoon wind blew, bringing the brisk chill of the day's end. I walked down the steps slowly, my heart much lighter than before. There are encounters that don't bring you joy, but they help you drop the dead weight. And for me, that was more than enough. I didn't go straight back to the Upper West Side. I took a long walk by the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir in Central Park. The city skyline was starting to light up, and the glow from the street lamps reflected on the water like scattered fragments of memories. A soft, damp breeze cooled my mind after such an exhausting day. The meeting with Allison hadn't cured me completely, but I no longer felt suffocated. There are things that once you hear them with your own ears and see them with your own eyes, You no longer have to waste energy imagining. And when you stop imagining, the pain recedes. I stopped by the wrought iron fence staring at the water. In that moment, I thought of my mother. I hadn't told her anything since the beginning, not to hide it from her, but because I needed to survive the initial impact on my own. But now that the dust was starting to settle, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before she picked up. Catherine. Her voice sounded as warm and steady as always. Hi, Mom. It's me. You've been very busy lately. I called you a few times and you didn't answer. I gripped the phone. Yeah, I've had a lot on my plate. My mother went quiet for a moment, then asked, softening her tone, Is something wrong, sweetheart? That question put a lump in my throat again. I looked at the reservoir, forcing my voice to stay steady. Mom, Jason, and I are getting a divorce. There was silence on the other end. Not of surprise, but the silence of someone trying to process it. What happened, honey? She asked without raising her voice. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't mention Allison or what I had heard and seen or the corporate espionage. I just said it as concisely as possible. He's with someone else. My mother sighed, a very faint sound. I see. Just those 2 words, but I heard so much in them. No drama, no scolding, just a sad acceptance. Are you okay? She asked. I smiled a little, even though she couldn't see me. I'm okay. Are you really okay? She insisted. I stayed quiet for a second before saying, I'm starting to be. She didn't press for painful details. She simply said, If you're too exhausted, come home for a few days. That sentence made my eyes fill with warmth. I looked at the water and saw my own blurry reflection among the city lights. Okay. I'll clear my schedule and come see you, I answered. All right. And whatever it is, talk it out with me. Don't keep it all bottled up inside. I will. Bye, Mom. I hung up and stood there a while longer before turning back toward the street. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was completely resolved, but because I was no longer carrying it all alone. The next morning, I arrived at the office just like any other day. But the second I stepped into the lobby, the shift was undeniable. It wasn't just curious glances anymore. This time, there were actual whispers. I walked past 2 receptionists and caught a fragment. They say he got suspended for a data leak, and his wife works right upstairs. I didn't stop. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. In the enclosed space, I watched the digital numbers climb, but my heart wasn't racing like the day before. The news was already out. When I got to my desk, a close coworker walked over. Catherine, she whispered. I stopped organizing my desk. Yeah? She glanced over her shoulder and lowered her voice. Jason was called up to the executive wing first thing this morning. They say he's been suspended pending an investigation. I nodded. Yeah, I know. She looked at me with genuine concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. She didn't push it, just squeezed my arm in a show of support and went back to her cubicle. I sat down, turned on my monitor, and saw a new company-wide email. It was an internal memo, extremely brief. Please be advised that Jason, an employee in the projects division, has been temporarily suspended from his duties, pending an internal review. No details, no explanations. But for everyone on the floor, it was more than enough. I read the email and closed it. I didn't feel satisfaction or pity. It was simply another domino falling in the chain of events that had already been set in motion. Right at lunchtime, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother-in-law. I looked at the caller ID, hesitated for a few seconds, and answered. Hello? Catherine. Her voice wasn't warm like usual. It sounded rushed and anxious. Jason just told me about you two. What on earth is going on? I stood up and walked out into the hallway to speak in private. We're getting a divorce. Divorce? What divorce? She was talking fast. Every marriage has problems, but you fix things by talking. Why are you taking this to such an extreme? Take a breath. This can't be fixed. If Jason did something wrong, I'll talk to him myself. I'll set him straight. But you have to think about the family. I paused for a second and then said, I've already done a lot of thinking. She didn't stop. I also heard you caused a massive problem with his job. You are destroying him. That sentence left me frozen. I am not destroying anyone, I said slowly. I just stopped covering up what he was doing. But he's your husband, she yelled, raising her voice. You're supposed to protect him. We won't be husband and wife for much longer, I replied. Silence fell on the other end. Then her voice softened a bit, though it remained incredibly tense. Catherine, I know you're a capable woman, and you make your own money. But a family isn't just about who's right and who's wrong. Sometimes, you just have to let things go. Hearing her, I felt a deep emptiness. I liked my mother-in-law. She wasn't a difficult or overly critical woman. She used to defend me even more than she defended Jason. But in that moment, I understood that her defense only existed while the waters were calm. When the ship starts sinking, people always side with their own blood. I understand, I said. But there are things I cannot let go. She sighed. Then what do you want? We are going to handle things exactly according to the law, I answered. I don't want to talk about the rest. There were no more arguments from her. After a long pause, she simply said, Have it your way. The call ended. I stood in the hallway for a moment and then walked back to my desk. Everything around me was running its normal course, but inside me, the last thread tying me to that family had snapped. There were no attachments left. That afternoon, I got a text from Daniel. Jason's lawyer wants to meet tomorrow afternoon to finalize the agreement. Does that work for you? I read the message and replied quickly. Yes. I set the phone down and looked out the window. The late afternoon light was bathing the skyscrapers across the street, just like every day before. But the Catherine sitting there was no longer the same person. I knew tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be a walk in the park. When a person is cornered, they fight tooth and nail to save whatever scraps they have left. But this time, the one cornered wasn't me, and I had absolutely no intention of backing down. The next afternoon, I arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of nerves, but because I wanted a few moments to myself before the meeting started. We didn't meet at the coffee shop. We met in the small conference room at Daniel's firm, a closed, quiet space with bright, sterile lighting that left no room for beating around the bush. I sat down, placed my purse on the table, and laced my fingers together. There was a pitcher of water and 2 bound files already set out. I didn't open them. I just sat there, taking deep breaths, centering myself. The door opened. Daniel walked in first, greeting me with a nod, followed closely by Jason. Just the 2 of them. No Allison. I looked at Jason and immediately noticed the toll it had taken on him. His shirt wasn't perfectly ironed. His hair was messy, and his face looked visibly haggard. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The arrogant confidence was completely gone, replaced by a tension he couldn't hide. He sat across from me without saying a word. Daniel took the seat at the head of the table and opened his folder with his usual brisk tone. Let's get started. No one objected. He pushed my draft toward Jason. This is the agreement proposed by Miss Catherine. You have reviewed it. Jason nodded. Yes, I've read it. And do you have any objections? Jason didn't answer Daniel. He immediately looked at the papers and then looked at me. I want to talk directly to you first, he said. I have no objection, I replied. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the last bit of strength he had left. I can't accept all your conditions. I know, I said, but those are my conditions. If you take everything from me, I'll have absolutely nothing left to start over. I'm not taking anything that's yours, I said slowly. I'm just taking back what was always mine. He clenched his jaw. You know I don't mean that. You know exactly what I mean. I held his gaze. You want to keep what you stole. My words hung suspended in the air unanswered. Daniel didn't intervene. He let us talk, limiting himself to jotting down a few things on his legal pad. Catherine. Jason continued, lowering his voice. I'm not denying I made a massive mistake, but you should give me an out. I already gave you an out, I replied. I haven't asked for a single cent that isn't backed by bank statements and proof. But you're including the transfers I made. He stopped, as if carefully weighing his words. To Allison. I am including the transfers that came out of our joint marital account, I corrected him. Who you gave the money to is your business. The tension in the room spiked, but it didn't explode. It was like a string pulled to the absolute limit, a millimeter away from snapping. Jason leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a second, and then looked back at me. Do you really feel absolutely nothing for me anymore? He asked. The question didn't surprise me. It was his last, desperate attempt to drag me back to the past. Feelings have nothing to do with this, I said. This is simply a matter of fairness. So if I agree to all this, you'll stop making my life a living hell? I have never made your life a living hell, I replied coldly. You did all of this to yourself. He smiled bitterly. Now you sound like a lawyer. I had to learn, I said. A long silence stretched out. Then Daniel stepped in. Allow me to clarify a point. If an agreement is not reached today, this matter will go to litigation in a civil court. In that scenario, the court will review not only the division of assets and finances, but also conduct that constitutes a breach of fiduciary duties during the marriage. I believe you fully understand what that implies. Jason didn't look at Daniel. He kept his eyes locked on me. Do you really want to take it to that extreme? He asked. If I have to, yes, I answered without blinking. He nodded slowly, as if reality had finally crushed him. I need time, he said. You've already had time, I replied immediately. Since the day I handed you that draft. I need more, he insisted. At least a week. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him and then at Daniel. Prolonging this only makes sense if there is a real intention to negotiate, Daniel stated. If this is simply a stall tactic, it is unnecessary. Jason stayed silent for a few seconds. I'll sign, he said quietly, but I need to get my finances in order to make the payments in a single lump sum. I looked at him, and for the first time, I could see he wasn't playing games. 3 days, I said. Not a day more. He looked up. 3 days isn't enough. It's enough, I replied. You started moving your finances a long time ago. My words left him frozen in his chair. I knew he understood exactly what I meant. He had been preparing his exit strategy for months. Only he never imagined his exit would look like this. Fine, he said after a long moment. 3 days. Daniel wrote it down and nodded. Then we are in agreement. 3 days from now, both parties will meet here to execute the final documents. The meeting seemed officially over, but Jason didn't stand up. He sat there, looking at me with an expression that was hard to read. Catherine, he said, his voice almost a whisper. If none of this had happened, do you think things would be different between us? I looked at him. That question wasn't trying to change the outcome. It was just him begging for an answer for his own conscience. No, I said. He frowned slightly. Why? Because what happened wasn't an unexpected mistake, I continued. It was the result of a rot that was already there. He didn't say anything else. He stood up, took his copy of the papers, gave Daniel a curt nod, and walked out. When his hand touched the doorknob, he paused for a fraction of a second, but he didn't turn around. The door opened and closed. The conference room fell silent again. I sat there for a few seconds, then let out a long, shaky sigh. Not out of exhaustion, but because a moment of immense, suffocating tension had finally broken. Daniel closed his file. "You handled that perfectly." I smiled weakly. "I just did what I had to do." He looked at me with a different kind of respect. Not everyone would be capable of that. I didn't answer. I stood up and grabbed my purse. 3 days, I said. "Yes," he nodded. "I'll have the final copies ready for signature." I walked out of the office. The late afternoon air was soft. The sun had lost its bite. A light breeze drifted down the avenue carrying that familiar New York mix exhaust fumes and blooming park trees. I stopped for a moment on the steps, watching the pedestrians rush by. Life kept moving, completely indifferent to anyone's personal tragedies. Deep down, a very clear feeling began to form. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't joy. It was certainty. I was nearing the end of that brutal road, and this time, I would cross the finish line entirely on my own 2 feet. 3 days later, I didn't arrive early, and I didn't arrive late. I arrived exactly on time, maintaining the same precision, self-sufficiency, and lack of excess that I had carried throughout my 3 years of marriage. Daniel's office looked identical to the last time. The small conference room, the long mahogany table, the harsh white light, nothing to distract from the reality of the moment. Everything was straightforward, just like what was about to happen. Daniel was already there. When he saw me walk in, he greeted me with a brief nod. On the table, 2 identical sets of documents were laid out, one for each of us, perfectly stapled and marked with "Sign Here" stickers. Jason arrived about 2 minutes later. He walked in without scanning the room, barely offering a greeting. His eyes brushed mine for a fraction of a second before locking onto the file in front of him. The last 3 days clearly hadn't been kind to him. His face was paler, his eyes more sunken, but this time, there was no fight left in his gaze, only a hollow acceptance. He sat down. No one spoke immediately. The room no longer felt like a pressure cooker. It felt solemn, like the dead calm that comes after a catastrophic storm. Daniel broke the silence. "Today we will proceed with the signing of the divorce agreement as previously negotiated. I must remind both parties that once executed, all clauses will be legally binding. Please review the documents one final time." Jason nodded. "I will." I did the same. Daniel opened the folders and slid a copy toward each of us. I flipped through the pages even though I had read them 100 times before. The lines of black ink, the crystal clear clauses, stripped of all emotion or memory, just firm boundaries. The Upper West Side apartment was legally mine. Jason was legally obligated to transfer back the portion of the SUV down payment taken from the joint account. The money transfers were meticulously documented and had to be reimbursed in specific installments. No shared children, no additional responsibilities, no remaining ties. I stopped on the last page. The signature line waited blank. I set the pen on the table without signing yet. I looked up. Jason was also looking at the last page, his hand holding a pen suspended over the paper without moving. A heavy silence stretched out. No one rushed him. Finally, Jason was the one who spoke first. "Catherine," he said, looking up at me. "When we sign this, it's really over, isn't it?" The question no longer carried a pleading tone. It was more of a final confirmation, a verbal way of processing the reality crashing down on him. "Yes," I answered. He gave a faint nod. "I never thought this day would actually come," he said, his voice scratchy. "Neither did I replied. He managed to sketch a minimal smile. 3 years went by really fast. I didn't say anything. For me, those 3 years hadn't been fast or slow. They had been a road with enough good parts to keep me walking and enough cracks to end up breaking my ankles. I always thought that no matter what happened, you would be the one who'd stick around until the bitter end," he continued. "I thought so too," I said. My answer left him speechless. He looked at me a moment longer, then looked back down at the paper. "I'm sorry," he said. This time, it wasn't a rushed, desperate apology to save himself. It was slow, clear, and loaded with the weight of absolute defeat. I heard him, but I didn't answer right away. There are apologies that arrive too late. Not because they lack meaning, but because they no longer possess the power to change a single thing. "I heard you." I said just that. No lingering resentment, no grand absolutions, just an acknowledgement of receipt. He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant and lowered the pen to the paper. The exact instant the tip touched the line, I saw it. His hand hesitated with an almost invisible tremor, but it was there. Then he signed. His name appeared on the paper in that familiar handwriting I had seen on so many leases, bills, and even old birthday cards. This time it was in a very different place, a place of closure. He set the pen down and Daniel turned to me. "Miss Catherine?" I nodded and picked up my pen. My hand wasn't shaking. I looked at the blank line and wrote my name, Catherine. My handwriting was exactly the same as always. It hadn't changed. The only difference was that the woman holding the pen was no longer the same woman from 3 years ago. When I put the pen down, I didn't feel the crushing pain I had always imagined. There wasn't a single second where my heart contracted with grief. There was only a burning, undeniably clear sensation. It was over. Daniel collected both copies, checked the signatures one last time, and stamped them with his notary seal. "With this, everything is finalized," he declared. There was no applause, no congratulations, no formal ceremony. Just a dry, simple sentence. But it was enough to officially bury a marriage. Jason was the first to stand up. He didn't look at me right away. He adjusted his collar out of pure nervous habit and then turned toward the door. "I'm leaving," he said. I nodded. There was no handshake, no final hug, no tearful goodbye. He turned his back to me and walked out the door. This time he didn't stop in the doorway. The heavy door opened and clicked shut. I sat there for a few more seconds, staring at the empty space across the table. There was no one across from me anymore. There was absolutely nothing left to say. Daniel gathered the executed documents and put them in his briefcase. "Do you need me to call you a car to go home?" "No need," I said. "I can walk." He nodded. "If you need anything else from here on out, don't hesitate to contact me." "I will." I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the conference room. The hallway outside felt blindingly bright. The natural light pouring in through the large glass panes made everything look sharper, cleaner. I walked slowly, taking my time. When I reached the main doors of the building's lobby, I stopped for a moment. Not because I was afraid to keep going, but because I wanted to lock that exact instant into my memory. A long, exhausting road had finally come to an end. No turning back, no regrets. Only the future remained. I walked down the concrete steps. The wind brushed softly against my face. New York City was exactly the same. The cabs, the sirens, the people, everything kept flowing. The only thing different was me. I didn't go straight back to the apartment. I walked aimlessly for a while, letting my body get used to the feeling of empty space. I stepped into a small, quiet coffee shop. I ordered an iced tea and sat alone by the window, watching the crowd blur past. Suddenly, a certainty hit me. I didn't feel abandoned anymore. Before all this, I used to think that if I lost someone, I would lose everything. But now I understood that there are certain things in life that only truly belong to you when you have the courage to let go of what no longer deserves you. I pulled out my phone and texted my mother. "It's done, Mom," she replied almost instantly. "Good. Come home for a few days, sweetheart." I looked at the glowing screen and gave a slight smile. "I'm on my way." I locked the phone and took a sip of the tea. It was a little bitter at first, but it left a sweet aftertaste, something akin to everything I had just survived. Allison hadn't stolen my husband. She had simply taken a man who, in reality, no longer belonged to me anyway. And what I had managed to keep wasn't a bank account, a piece of property, or a corporate title. It was myself. A woman who had walked through a catastrophic betrayal without losing her essential worth. A woman who knew exactly when to pull the emergency cord, and who knew how to start completely over without needing anyone else to draw her the map. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill my lungs, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk. Life was moving forward, and this time, I was walking with it, without looking back.